Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Blacks Only. That's right, Blacks Only on the Big Liberty Show. This is the show that makes fun, that pokes fun at society's obsession with race and identity politics by basically suggesting in a cynical way that yes, you can have blacks only on the show, but where the diversity really matters is intellectual. Intellectual diversity is more important than anything aesthetic. Guys, welcome to the show. I have a very jam-packed show for you today, with two guests who I think you guys will be very familiar with and who have become and are regular contributors to the show. Remember, guys, the Big Liberty Show now comes to you in two formats in a week. There is the flagship show, the Big Liberty Show itself, which comes out every Wednesday, and of course, Blacks Only, which comes out on a Monday. Guys, welcome to the show. I'm not alone in studio. I'm joined, of course, by my two very able guests. Closest to me, of course, is Mr. Dumo Denga, the host of the Manpatria show. That is another podcast which I highly encourage you guys to come listen to. In fact, I'll run that link on the screen. Dumo, how are you doing?
I'm good, and you, Sihle?
Welcome, brother man. And of course, a very familiar face, the resident anarchist who always shakes things up in the house. Mpiyakhe, Dhlamini, how you doing, brother?
I'm good, my man. How are you?
I'm good, guys. Fellas, let's hop straight into it. It's been a rather interesting week in terms of the news cycle and, some of the characters that we've seen. Let me begin on the more sort of topical one because they're literally in court this week. The EFF's leader, Julius Malema, and Mbuyiseni, Ndlozi, two very central figures in that political party, caught almost red-handed, if I can call it that, excuse the pun, assaulting on camera a police officer. This was at the funeral of the Winnie Mandela Party. I made the point in a vlog 15, if you want to check it out on the Big Liberty Show channel. I made the point on the channel that this shouldn't surprise anybody who is a student of history and who understands what the left generally looks like when it is in the process of seeking political power or state power. They are violent and they are fascist in nature. Dumo.
Yeah, that is true. I've seen it so many times. I mean, you read about it even in, in Russia, in Africa, in Venezuela, Cuba, everything like that. Violence seems to be a justification because a lot of people on the left feel that their policies are so moral and so justified that, you know what, if the ends justify the means, and if violence is the means, then they feel it's justified. And it's a pretty sad thing, to be honest.
Mpiyakhe, this is what happens when your ideology is rooted in the idea of force and coercion. In other words, forcing other people to ascribe to your sense of morality or your sense of a socialist utopia. You get the violence that comes with it, don't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we saw with the organizing tactics, just going back a little bit in history, the organizing tactics of whether it's the Bolsheviks or the Nazi brown shirts and later the black shirts. It's always violence based because these people are implicitly admitting that they can't win on the strength of their ideas, so they have to use violence. And once you have to resort to violence, you've lost the argument, and so there's nothing you can do but use violence. I think for us, just to be vigilant.
And I fully agree with you. I mean, you raised, just as maybe a final point, because I want us to move on, you raised the issue of the Nazis. A lot of people forget or omit or even ignore the fact that Nazis were actually socialists. They were self-described socialists. And if you look through their 25-point plan, the one they went into, their manifesto that they looked into, they went into the election with, one of them, by the way, one of the provisions on there was expropriation of land without compensation. And a lot of people forget that that policy isn't a nice, gentle and peacefully redistributive policy. It's force. It's the idea that there could potentially be state power, which obviously comes with guns, that points a gun in your face and says, I will take this from you to give to someone else, isn't it? Maybe as we recap up this particular point, fellas, talk to me about, and I want to be specific here, talk to me about, I think, how reasonable people perhaps push back against this because we obviously are at the forefront in terms of, the Big Liberty show, the Manpatria show, but how does the ordinary person fight back? So I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to posit myself as a lefty, a red in tooth and claw EFFer, and I'm going to put two different policy proposals to you, and I want to hear a rebuttal, something that someone can use as a tool in their argument against these ideas. Dumo, no, how dare you, Dumo? I'm a lefty, and I believe that my vision of society, which requires everybody to be equal, because if we're all equal, we're doing well, means that I must take from those evil whites who stole everything and give and redistribute to blacks. How would you possibly be against that, Dumo?
No, I'm against that because if you're that requires a lot of concentration of power within the state. And if the state is going to use that power to take it away from whites, what's stopping them to take it away from you? And we've even seen in some countries what they've even done. They've used that power to politically control people so that they can actually get the votes. Because if you don't vote for this party, then what we're going to do is going to take your property away from you. So, you have to think about it in the long term. That's how I'd respond.
No ways, you guys. No ways. Mpiyakhe, he's a right winger in any event. And actually we'll come to that in the later segment of the show. But, he's a right winger. Of course you'd say that. But I've heard you before, Dumo, Mpiyakhe, make the point that where will I get all the money for all of my socialist policies? Well, I'm just going to print the money. There's a reserve bank, isn't it? We just nationalize the reserve bank, we print the money, and I can dish it out. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's something called supply and demand. So the more, money is just like any other good. There's nothing special about it. Or other currency is just like any other good in the market. So there's nothing special about it. The law of supply and demand holds. The more of it that you create, the less its value will be relative to everything else because you've created more of it. So if you want to print money and there's no natural constraint, it's just paper money that can be. I mean, that's the whole reason why you have inflation targeting. Is because it was recognized that there's a moral hazard in having the monopoly over printing money with government. At the same time, there's nothing naturally limiting that, like gold. Gold acts as a natural limit on how much money you can print. Whereas with the fiat currency like we currently have, you need something like inflation targeting to approximate, even though it doesn't do it quite well, but to approximate the restraining effects of a gold standard or something like that. So if you print more money, the money will be devalue and prices will skyrocket. You'll get hyperinflation.
Fellas, I purposefully went into my leftist character. I'll take the hat off now of being a lefty, but I purposefully went into this character because, Dumo, I think you and I spotted on social media, albeit it was directed at me and a few other individuals, Ngwenga, etc., a certain very prominent journalist in this country, Farrell Hoffa, who basically tweeted a thread suggesting a myriad of things, but her key, if I can call it analysis or argument, is that, hey, there is the rise of the new right, as she described it. She lumped the likes of Ernst Roots, John Steenhuisen, Ngwenga, and me into this, and if I can try and recall it verbatim, very articulate but very data-driven, with a very poor understanding of what happens on the ground in reality, is what she put it. And of course, she was linking it to an interview that Herman Pretorius from the Institute of Race Relations had in on ENCA, where he was debating with is it Prince Mashele? The analyst. And the thing about Herman is, yes, he's very data driven, but also he's able to apply the data in its context. So if you're talking about voting patterns, he'll show you what the voting patterns are and break it down by political parties. So if you want to argue, for example, as was the case on the show, that the DA is a white party, it doesn't have black voters, and then Herman goes into detail to say, actually, the DA on its own has more black voters within it than all the other opposition parties put together. That's data, and it's put into context. It's not us not acknowledging the real world. But I want to come back to this slur then, if I can call it a slur, that is therefore thrown at us using these arguments as a premise. We're data-driven, we are blah, blah, blah. What does it mean, to be on the right? Are we accepting this term? And if we do accept it, how do we define it? Are we the sort of traditional view of what the right is? You know, guys on horses, who fall off horses wearing, you know, khaki shorts and two-tone T-shirts, you know, that sort of stereotype, if you will, even though that wasn't really the right, but in any event. But what is it to be on the right? Mpiyakhe, I'm going to go to you first.
Well, the term has sort of lost its traditional meaning. I mean, it's changed many times. I think the original use was during the French Revolution. This is where the original French left and right wing came from, because, you know, the people who were tended to be more liberal and more leftist, they tended to sit on the left of the States General Chamber, and then the people who were more defending the traditional institutions like the monarchy and the nobility sat on the right of the chamber. And so that's where it comes from, that's the historical context. But now, I'm not quite sure what it means now. In South Africa, it tends to mean... during our transition period, there will be a lot of organizations such as the AWP, which opposed the reforms. So in South Africa, it can mean that. But generally speaking, it means to people who want to conserve traditions and institutions that are currently existing. And in South Africa, I just don't think, I don't see enough that I mean, the liberals are calling for their own sort of revolution in how we view things, putting the individuals at the center, which is something South Africa as a state has never really done.
A radical departure.
It's radical. I would think it's the very opposite of what right wing traditionally means. And the left is as well is also quite radical, but then they're not being accused of being right wing. So I suppose, but yeah, so it's a very radical philosophy, liberalism in South Africa. I mean, if we were in America and then we were punting liberalism, maybe it's not so radical there, but here it's quite radical. Yeah.
Dumo, this concept, are we the khaki wearing old stereotype trying to hold on to traditions of the past, or what does it really mean? What are we fighting for? And why are we actually, you know, far from being the outright or the right? Like, what do we actually stand for?
Well, we stand for, you know, private property rights, you know, focusing on the individual, you know, free markets, you know, not having the state interfere into your private affairs. That's the core concept of liberalism in South Africa. I mean, Americans will call that libertarianism. But I think also, you know, just talking about the left and the right, I mean, yeah, it has become so confusing and contaminated that people don't even know what is left and right. But I think, you know, I mean, based on standard definitions, you tend to find, I'll just define it based on the patterns I see.
Got it.
That if you look at the left are people that focus more on socialism, and then the right are people that focus more on, you know, free markets and stuff like that. So I think that now when they say the new right, in South Africa, I think what they're focusing more on is really what is it's mainstream versus not so mainstream. So the right is seen as not so mainstream, the left is mainstream. And because our views are considered not so mainstream and also radical, as Mpiyakhe said, I think that's where the new right term comes from. But I think it also is they're trying to also make it a pejorative at the same time. So that's the thing. So like if you own it, you know, I mean, I wouldn't mind owning it. It's just that we'll
if
just
you own it, define it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the moral of the story, because there's another aspect I want to bring in here, which is, this is where the slur part comes in usually on social media. The idea that somehow, because we're black South Africans, that it's weird that we have and we hold the ideas that we do. You know, in fact, I don't know if you've experienced it, but on social media, I go through the gauntlet of insults from Uncle Tom to, and I hate to say this, but yes, the K word is thrown at me by the very people who often argue are anti-racist or non-racial, but that's another contradiction for another day. You know, bootlicker, blah, 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 you name it. And essentially what it is it's our rejection of the leftist dogma, the leftist socialist communist ideals that are argued to be quote unquote pro-black, that sees us attract these sort of attacks on our persons, our personalities. Maybe to cap this point, because I want us to move to the last area, there is a conversation to be had here, guys, about our mission, perhaps all three of us, as we lie on the different spectrum, you know, from being classical liberal to libertarian, classical liberal to being anarchist. There is a mission that we have, which I think is threatening certain people who've had it very good for a long time in terms of their dominance of the narrative in society. You won't find characters like us on talk radio, in this country. On talk radio, you have the likes of Eusebius Makeza, Bongani Bengwa, etc., etc. These are all, broadly speaking, leftist identitarian type characters, and you hear it also in how. For instance, there's a big clash between what they often suggest is reality, if you will, and even the people who call into their shows. Often you find the host becomes very aggressive or antagonistic and even shuts down callers, because there is a very big chasm between who these people are as these academic work types and who the ordinary South African is. And this is what I want to put to you guys. In my experience on the Big Liberty Show, interviewing South Africans on the ground, which Farrell, by the way, is what I do on the show. So it's funny that you say I'm just based in studio or based on data. I actually talk to people, the people that you don't talk to, funny enough, ordinary people. If you talk to ordinary South Africans, there's three things you quickly realize about them in terms of their values. That is, they're God-fearing, they're law-abiding by and large, and they're family-orientated in terms of their values. And those three things guide, to a large extent, how they view the world and why there is a big mismatch between what the politicians talk about, which is none of those values, but more government control, politicians decide, and you're just a beneficiary of their patronage. There's a growing chasm between the two and a growing tension between these two. How do we resolve it? Obviously, none of us are going to go into party politics, and no one here, belongs to any political party. But the ideas that we fight for, Dumo, we walk into a township. What are we advocating for to the individual who has those values?
Well, we advocate that, look, I mean, you can, own your own piece of property and, do whatever you want with it. You shouldn't allow the government to dictate to you what you can and cannot have. And I think that's the key thing, because many South Africans, what they just want is their own property to live on. They want to send their kids to a good school, go to work, pay for it, and live a comfortable life and see their kids becoming successful. That's basically what they want. And I won't lie, the left has taken advantage of that and has used emotion to try and push them towards socialism, and by giving them the wrong information and stuff like that, which they call real life experiences. And then when we give them the data, they just throw it away. But ultimately, it's just about, having your own and deciding what you want to do in life. And that's what we try to push to them. Because even in your interviews with these EFF guys a while back, you ask them questions like, well, you're selling stuff here. Do you think that the state should tell you what you can and cannot sell? Can the state take that away? And they're like, no, of course not. And I just think I think maybe the thing is that we just need to show how much we have in common, because I think what tends to happen is that when we interact with people, normal South Africans, we tend to think that we're a bit like confrontational, and then that kind of makes it even harder to convince people. But that's my opinion.
Mpiyakhe, I'm going to come to you because Dumo raises a very important point around. Remember, the question I'm asking is, we're heading into the communities, whether it's a township, a rural area, and we're trying to convince people of our ideas. So we agree that we share the values, right? Being sort of, by and large, God-fearing, because we're 97% Christian country, family-orientated in terms of values, and of course, law-abiding. South Africans actually have a very profound respect for the rule of law and the idea of order, spontaneous and even regulated, right? These are values that sort of form a glue between us as South Africans. But now the ideas is what we need to sell Abantu on. What are you selling people on? How do you take the liberty message into a community? And let's be specific, a black township. How do you convince Abantu that freedom and markets are the way forward?
So how I would approach it is to focus on the people who've been left out. So I think, in as much as South Africa is very Christian and all of those things, I would focus on people like, for example, gay people. I think once the woke racial nationalists get what they want, after they are done with white people, they are going to start targeting minorities like gays and so on. So
we've already seen it, by the way, even with Indians. Sorry to cut your train of thoughts. I mean, Malema is starting to diversify his range of who to attack. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine. So I think focusing on bringing that message about, okay, we care about families, we don't care what kind of families. You can be a gay family, you can be same-sex family, or you can be I don't know, whatever combination you want to do, as long as everyone consents. So we want to bring that message, and also people like small business owners, people like people who are excluded right now because of things like NetLac, where you basically get big corporates and big unions coming together and setting the economic policy for everyone else, setting how everyone else should organize their production among themselves, government, unions, and business. And so like small business owners, and then the unemployed, people who have been left out of the system. No one realizes this, but no one in South Africa speaks for the unemployed, including people who have been affected negatively by BE and affirmative action. I mean, there's a lot of students, for example, excellent students, bright students, who wanted to study medicine and become good doctors for this country, but they couldn't get the university spaces because of our horrible affirmative action policies. So all of those excluded groups, I would focus on them. And
this must be said, and I'm going to be unequivocal in saying this, guys. Policies like affirmative action and broad-based black economic empowerment are not pro-black. There's nothing pro-black about them. When you have a policy that literally chooses people based on race and not based on their circumstance, then invariably what you tend to find is the politics gets involved.
Exactly.
And it's those who are in the close proximity of political power who happen to be black who become the beneficiaries at the expense, of course, of the vast majority of those who happen to be black but are poor. And this is a debate I think we'll have on the show in future. As we sort of look to wrap up, Mpiyakhe, I know there's an article that you're going to be putting out very soon. I want us to quickly just go through it, not through the article itself, but the key concepts you bring in. Essentially, you headed the title, Africa, the lessons it can learn from China. And I think you're being purposeful in this because it's often said that China, and if you listen to the EFF, they'll make the argument, we need to be like China because China is a communist society and it's communism that brought them all this fantastic wealth and the raising of living standards. But Mpiyakhe, your thesis is different, isn't it?
No, I actually addressed that point. That doesn't seem to make sense to me because before 1978, the Chinese economy was 100% controlled by the states, and it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, since the end of 1978 or 79, I'm not sure, but it was the 11th, it was a conference of the Communist Party bigwigs, the Central Committee. They met and they decided to, after Mao had died, and then the replacement leader sort of tried to continue the course with Mao's original vision, and then it failed. And then eventually the Communist Party decided, okay, you've had this guy, Deng Xiaoping, he's been advocating for these things for years. Mao's circle even considered him a right-winger and all of these things.
There's that right-winger.
Exactly. Some of the slurs that we experienced. So he was, even though he was in the Communist Party and a strong socialist ideologically, he was considered right-wing in China. So there you go. But anyway, so he had proposed for a while that they need to reform, they need to, and just to give you one of his quotes, he believes that there is no fundamental contradiction between a market economy and the socialist economy. And he wanted to show that. And now China's economy is 70, as of 2005, it was 70% private sector dominated in terms of GDP, and whereas it used to be 100% state-owned. Poverty declined, extreme poverty between 1990 and 2004, 2015 rather, declined from 66% to less than 1%. It just shows the power of markets. I mean, and they've done things like follow. They followed the reforms. They had examples to follow within China, whether it was the peasants themselves just ignoring the laws and saying, oh, to hell with it, we will sell our extra produce on the markets even though it's illegal. And they just started doing it. And luckily for them, Mao had died, and then the Communist Party was looking for a new way. And so once Deng took over, not officially by the way, the Communist Party is very weird in China. So he took over, and then he started following the example from the peasants, I guess, and saying, okay, these people are already doing this, so let's extend this system, make it legal, and then extend it to the state-owned companies as well, as to say to the managers of the state-owned companies, okay, the state owns you, but all decisions are yours. You take responsibility for the profits and the costs and everything else, the profits and the losses. And then we also allow you, we also make sure that there's competition, you face competition. We allow the private sector to come in, and also we implement special economic zones across the country. And so one of the smart things they did was, one of the first economic zones was Shenzhen, which was a poor fishing village. And so they said, okay, this is one of the poorest areas in the country, so let's try this silly free market economics. And at the time it had like a population, this was in the late 70s, it had a population of 10,000 people, and now it is a population of more than 10 million people. And it's one of the richest cities in the world, I think now.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to extend our time just for a couple of minutes, because I think this is a very important topic to have. Dumo, I'm going to come to you, because if you look at the Chinese experiment, a lot of it, and I want to bring in, there used to be an organization called the Unirule Institute, which provided very sort of free market based research out of China, and ironically it was shut down by the repressive government, because the data was basically making the argument that it's the freedoms, it is the market approach which creates the wealth. In fact, one of their reports, I remember, Tom Palmer actually put me on it, shout out to Tom Palmer, was that the Chinese wealth is 100% created by the private sector. None of it, the Chinese government, if anything, is a consumer of the wealth in that part of the world. And when we talk about private sector, we don't mean big corporations necessarily. It also comes down even to the mom and pop shop on the corner that sells, dumplings or whatever the case may be. It's the idea that you freed up millions of individuals who used to be rural peasants locked in there by the sort of collectivist agrarian communist policies. You freed up this labor force for people to innovate, to either become workers in the burgeoning industry, or entrepreneurs on the street, so to speak. And it's those individuals who had access to now income. From income, they built savings. From their savings, they bought options that created the raised living standards in China. Tell me, Dumo, and I'm going to be a bit cheeky here, why shouldn't South Africa go down that path?
Why shouldn't? I would say they should.
There you go.
Because it makes sense. I mean, this example is not only in China, but in many parts of the world.
That's right.
I mean, we've seen it. I mean, even after, like, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were many countries that actually implemented free markets, and their economies grew exponentially.
Absolutely.
And then even in South America, there was Chile as well. I know they're having some problems now with that bus system, but the reality is that when they started to implement free markets, the economy grew. And countries that went in the opposite direction, they went in the opposite direction from a economic perspective. Exactly. If you look at Venezuela,
downhill.
Yeah, it went downhill
real quick. Hey man, guys, I'll play the lefty as a final question. The lefty then comes in. He's heard this conversation. How dare you, Mpiyakhe, write about all this liberalization of a communist society? We need a communist society. In fact, the lefty would say, especially if he was wearing a beret, black people in this country just don't have the capacity, because of 400 years of colonialism and slavery. Black people don't have the capacity to be able to thrive in a free market. In fact, if you opened up the economy to a free market, the whites would just come back and control us. They'll take the land again of what we were able to redistribute, and they'll impose poverty on us. That's why we need a government to look after poor black people. Guys, how is this leftist wrong? Yeah.
So one of the examples from China is that while China was still poor and largely unskilled and all of those things, the Chinese Communist Party realized that they needed to get investment from outside. So they liberalized their import restrictions, things like tariffs and so on, so that you could get investment largely from the West, but also other places coming into China. And so the fact that they could have had that fear and said, hey, but our peasants are not educated, they don't have the capital, they are not skilled enough to compete against these foreigners. But what's actually happened is that those foreigners came to serve the needs and wants of the Chinese citizens. And because of that, because that's how economics works, it's not a zero-sum game. Exactly. It's a cooperative game where you try and serve each other's needs. Like, you give me something I want, I give you something you want. That's how it works. And because it works like that, China has been the biggest beneficiary of that investment, of that FDI flowing in from the rest of the world. And a lot of people don't understand this. There's a reason why countries that are developing late, like China, and hopefully South Africa as well, there is a reason why they do it faster than the first countries to develop, which were countries like Britain and Western Europe, America. It's because there's now been, because the first round of countries that are adopted capitalism have now built up so much capital that they can afford to export that capital, and then that leads to more rapid development as opposed to what would be the case if there was no like accumulated capital anywhere in the world.
And we should be a beneficiary of that as South Africans if we had the good policy. But remember, the question the lefty posed, Dumo, is no. This thing is racial. Remember, it's always down to race. Only whites can benefit in a free market, laissez-faire. I know you people, laissez-faire. Only whites can benefit from that. This thing is un-African. It's unheard of on the African continent. You need socialism. You need government control. Malema must control society for blacks to prosper. How am I wrong, Dumo?
No, it's well, you're wrong in that sense. Because the idea is that, well, the fact is Malema does not have enough information to determine the prices of goods and services and what people want in the market. In fact, when you look at all the big companies today, and not even big ones, but even small businesses that are serving needs, they actually go out into the markets and say, hey, here's a gap, let's spot it. I've seen a lot of that happening, and the government doesn't do that. So I mean, and also at the same time, you've seen examples when the government even tries to implement something like that, where they say that we'll give everybody shoes or something. They find out that they overproduce the shoes, or that there's too many size 1s and too little size 10s and everything like that, because they don't have that information and they're not invested in it. But people, as you may say, well, black people who, if they're deemed to be uneducated, they can still spot those gaps.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they can still provide those services. Those things happen. But it's just that you need to give them the freedom to do it. And once they have that freedom, you will see it progress. It has happened, everywhere in the world.
That's right.
And I
mean, there are examples here in Africa where that's happening.
Yeah.
Mauritius, Botswana, Rwanda being good examples. Guys, I must wrap it up here. Thank you so much. Maybe in just the last 3 seconds or so, Mpiyakhe, how do we find you on social media?
Twitter is at touring_1991. Facebook is just Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. And yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah.
Perfect. And of course, we can find your writing on the Daily Friend. This Chinese piece is going to come on.
Yeah, it's going to come out on the Daily Friend at some point. So yeah,
perfect. Look
out for that. And capitalism has worked every time it's been tried.
Yeah. Dumo, how do we find you, dog?
You can find me on Twitter at Dumo Denga. And if you want to go to my website, you just go to manpatria.com.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. And thank you, of course, for watching this installation of Blacks Only. We have these lively conversations all the time on the show. And as Mpiyakhe was trying to rush in there at the very end, Epstein didn't kill himself. Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. Guys, no, seriously, thank you so much for watching. Remember, you can support the show by becoming a friend of the IRR. That's their crowdfunding campaign. And you can do that by either SMSing your name to 32823. SMS will cost you R1. Terms and conditions apply. Or hey, if you're tech savvy, find us online at irr.org.za/join. Guys, thank you so much for watching as always. Really appreciate it. But remember, never trust a commie.